I'll send out an announcement just asking if I don't already have it, if you guys wouldn't mind emailing it to me.
Yeah, because I had somebody, at least in my animal science class, that I don't think he's in your plant class, that he's like moved. Yeah, no, he's not in here. So, but so addresses have changed, so we can't go by what's in the computer. So it's not. But
Right.
yeah. Okay. Well,
All
we're
right.
recording, so.
All right. Welcome back, everyone. And since we're getting ready to gear up for the holiday, I'll just go ahead and wish everyone a happy Thanksgiving. We were just talking about getting lab kits sent out. I finally got approval to do that, and have it paid for by the college. But most of those, I guess, will be sending to your all's home addresses that you supply me with. If you didn't do that, then please just send me an email giving me your address. And otherwise, I'll send out an announcement kind of reminding you of that. And we'll just try to get these all out in a timely manner so you can complete these last couple of labs. Um, on that note, we need to get back here to soil, water, and fertility management because we got a lot to cover. Hopefully we'll finish this chapter today. So we were just talking about kind of the biological part of soil here and how it's very important to understand that the soil is alive and the activity of the organisms does affect the availability, particularly of things like nitrogen and phosphorus in the soil. But we're talking about before we left is that ratio along with carbon. So the high carbon and nitrogen ratio can feed those organisms. That causes a depression of nitrogen for a short period of time. Let's how would you address that? One way you might address that is by adding nitrogen fertilizer, and um, many forms of nitrogen fertilizer out there. You could be adding manure, you could be tilling under or plowing under a cover crop. um, a whole lot of different ways you increase nitrogen, but probably the main way that we usually think about doing that is through adding a fertilizer. You throw it on there in the powder form, and in doing so, just recognize that you can also be increasing the salinity of the soil. And if you're increasing the salinity of the soil, then eventually you're going to have to desalinize the soil. We really need to remove excess soils or excess salts from the soil, excuse me. And generally speaking, the way to do that is through drainage. So flushing the soil with fresh water. It will happen naturally with rainwater, but we can also do that with irrigation water to a certain extent. Well water would be best. Either way, excess sodium's got to be removed um, for a variety of reasons. One is the whole potential dehydration issue, the inability for plants to take up water, as well as some overabundance of nutrients in some cases. So there are a couple other things that we could do to try to change the way that works in the soil. And one way, if we're talking about sodium in general, which sodium being the element uh, Na, and Na can make other elements not available. See what I did there? Because they are occupying Na, the sodium, which is a cation. Put that plus on there. Will occupy cation exchange sites. And while plants do need sodium in small amounts, they don't need it in the amounts that you ideally or shouldn't have in the soil, but could have through over fertilization. So removing excess sodium can be done by incorporating large quantities of calcium salt, such as gypsum, into the soil before it is flushed. And basically what that does is it will add some anions to the solution, which attracts those sodium cations out. You can also do that through reverse osmosis. And there is a, kind of a method of doing that. It's not easy, it's not cost effective, but it can be used. Much more likely to do that in a situation like in a greenhouse or something. So reverse osmosis is a potential use. Generally, though, you don't really have those available. And it's not easy just to add reverse osmosis water on a large scale to a field. All right, so those are some issues associated with over-fertilization and salinity. I guess the other big issue with over-fertilization is just that you can lock up the availability of other nutrients, and also just recognize that there is this fine line between an element, a nutrient being sufficient, mineral being sufficient in the soil, and a nutrient being sufficient in the plant, and it being overabundant or toxic. So just recognize that, and don't, too much of a good thing becomes a bad thing. Everything in moderation here, especially with plants. Of course, another huge issue with soil conservation is erosion. And that's pretty much a critical issue everywhere that agriculture is practiced. And we think of erosion mostly as the loss of topsoil, mostly through rain, but it can happen through wind as well. It does generally tend to be the most severe in areas that have more topography, more terrain, and high rainfall. But even in arid regions, you generally get a lot of that rainfall all at once. So it could be a short period of a lot of rainfall, not necessarily just a whole lot of rainfall over the season. So how do we prevent erosion? The absolute best way is to keep the soil covered with something. And plant cover is ideal, but if it can't be covered in plants, then there are other ways to look at that too. It could be covered in mulch, for instance, or even in erosion netting or something like that when plants aren't in place. Although I wouldn't recommend putting that erosion netting anywhere that you're going to eventually have plants growing. It ends up being a nightmare unless it is the biodegradable form. It is the bare soil that is most highly subject to erosion. Water is the most powerful force when it comes to erosion. It doesn't take very much time or a tremendous amount of water to erode and remove some of that fertile topsoil. So here in this image on the left, we can see that excess water, once the soil is saturated, you start to get runoff, and if it starts to channel, it forms a gully, then we'll start to exacerbate erosion. Here it is on bare soil. You can kind of see that it's even more subject here. On a relatively flat land here, it still happens. Of course, we want to. It's obvious, I think, that level land is less likely to erode from water. It still can, though. I mean, is any land perfectly level? No. I mean, you want there to be some drainage from that land. So usually there is some slight slope to it. More flat land is less susceptible to water erosion, but it can be more vulnerable to wind erosion. And this is one of the things that really led to the Soil Conservation and Natural Resource Conservation Service. The best protection against wind erosion also is vegetative cover of the soil itself, or you could also think of planting a windbreak where prevailing winds are blowing. You can also practice some different methods of tillage, such as stubble mulching. Again, that kind of keeps the soil covered, and that's using the existing crop residue as, kind of a mulch on the soil to prevent erosion. You can also kind of leave, maybe not practice one of those parts of land preparation, one of those parts of tillage that we usually would, such as disking or harrowing. So maybe you go ahead and plow it, but then you leave the surface rough or cloddy to kind of also reduce wind velocity at the soil surface. You would think that this isn't as big of a deal now, but it is. I mean, think about wind erosion, and that, I guess the best depiction of that was through the Dust Bowl back in the early 1900s, where we had over-plowing, overworking of the soil paired with a period of long extended drought, and then high winds come and just blow that topsoil away. Dust storms are pretty prevalent in the Midwest as well as the Southwest, where you have dry conditions and high winds. And that is loss of soil. It's also erosion. So in 1929, Congress established 10 soil conservation experiment stations and kind of effectively started this soil conservation service. And this really was partially in response to the Dust Bowl. And I think that became even more important on Black Sunday, April 14th, 1935. Even though we've started to already see some conservation measures in place, it hasn't been doing what it should have done. And they call it Black Sunday because it was the most severe dust storm in the US that, at least it had been recorded, where that dust, these particles of topsoil in the air, basically completely blacked out the midday sun. In fact, it was so bad that later on, that dust storm, which started in the Midwest and kind of the southern part of the Midwest, mostly in Texas and Oklahoma, it blew that dust, carried on the prevailing winds all the way to DC and New York, large populated areas, and of course DC, where the laws are made. So we get this guy, Hugh Hammond Bennett. Ironically, he was actually presenting to Congress the need for the soil conservation service at pretty much the same time one of these dust storms, blew this dust into DC. And so it was actually swiftly passed through, one of those unusual occurrences where legislation becomes enacted pretty quickly. And that started what then was called the Soil Conservation Service, and then later was renamed to the Natural Resource Conservation Service, which is a branch of the USDA. And look at this stark image here from that Dust Bowl era, where it was blowing soil to other farms, and in some cases, covering houses, covering machinery. Pretty crazy. And while that seems like, it's nearly a century ago now, but it seems like it's so long ago, there's still issues with soil erosion today. So let's look a little bit into some methods of soil conservation. One of these, they look at just kind of land capability classes. And there are 5 of these classes, one having very few limitations, and 5, basically you shouldn't be doing anything here. And what they're looking at is kind of the terrain and the soil types together, as well as the weather, to try to figure out which land should be used. So we think of this class 1 land and really class 2 land. These are really what we think of as our most arable land, places that we really can do some proper tillage for crop preparation. Of course, any kind of soil conservation measure is going to depend on what you're doing with the soil, as well as the lay of the land itself and the soil type. So if we don't have land that is suitable for agriculture, then generally, if it's not arable, maybe you'd have some livestock on like your class 3 land, but really class 4 and 5 land should mostly be left for wildlife and recreation. But every different type of agriculture should have its own kind of custom tailored conservation practices. And we're not talking about this really from, the environmental standpoint. We are to a certain extent, because if you look at water quality, again, sediment is the #1 pollutant, runoff of particles of soil. But really, I think along with that kind of environmental concern, we also have to think about the economic concern. You have to keep the soil in place to be able to grow the crops in order to make money. So soil erosion, I think, goes hand in hand with the economic picture. So here are some methods of soil conservation that have kind of started through, I think, the NRCS partially. And you guys are on farmland now, definitely talk to your NRCS agents. I think there is one for kind of each county, I believe. There's a lot of grant money out there. It's a lot of cost share programs, but usually, they're there to help you. So they'll often pay for seed for you to plant things like cover crops, and to get some of these methods of soil conservation in place. Back when we were farming full-time, landowners got an NRCS EQIP grant, which allowed us to basically build a hoop house for about $800. Of course, we built it ourselves, so that saved on the cost of it a little bit. But they also put in paddock systems for the pasture. They put a new pump and pumping system into the spring that was on the property. Gave us cover crop seed, gave us trees to plant. And most of that was at very little or no cost to us, the farmers. So consider talking to your NRCS agents and see what they might be able to do for you. Whether doesn't matter what you're growing, animals, plants, whatever. We all play a part in soil conservation. So here's one thing that we look at as a way to kind of conserve soil. This is a grass waterway here, which is basically just a strip of land, depending on the terrain and what it's draining, of varying width, that is basically seeded to some sort of cover crop, usually a grass, to kind of conduct and allow the water to kind of penetrate the soil rather than continue to run off. So we have cropping areas. Looks like corn was here on either side, but we keep this, looks like winter rye in here, kind of covered on the base, so that any soil that runs off is going to be stopped, at least partially, by that grass waterway. I think something that everyone should practice is contour tillage. And it's to do these days, especially if you have like a GPS guided equipment. But basically, you look at the contour line. So think of like on a topographic map, those lines basically, they also call them the key line, where it's the same elevation around instead of going up or down a slope. So if you kind of plant crops or form small ridges on the contour, then it slows the flow of any runoff or any water that's moving, and kind of sinks it into the soil and spreads it out rather than allowing it to run off. It percolates instead. So contour tillage, um, very smart way to really to save money in terms of applying water, make it easier to apply water. It's not the easiest thing to put into practice in terms of actually matching that contour to the land, but just by doing that, it can really save soil and I think other resources too, water itself. Here's kind of another look at kind of a similar thing. I think it's really kind of adding, kind of combining both the grass waterway idea with contour tilling. So in this case, we got some terrain here that is sloped, and we're alternating strips of solid planted crops versus row crops. So let's say we have like a wheat planted here, and then maybe a ground cover of rye or something like that. Whatever it is, maybe you have pasture grass, hay in between, areas of corn. But again, you want to kind of practice that on the contour itself. So strips of crops with strips of something else that doesn't require as much working of the soil. Same deal, holds water, holds soil in place. Terracing is a little bit more, I guess, invasive, but there are areas of the world, especially thinking of like parts of Asia where they're growing rice paddies. Terracing is a very important thing, even though it requires a lot of energy and input initially. So in this way, we're pretty much building some kind of berm, and kind of alternating that with a basin so that, again, the water is kind of spreading over an area and percolating rather than running off. These do have to be constructed with a slight grade so that excess water will flow slowly and forming some sort of outlet. And kind of in this picture, you can see that that is a grass waterway. Something that's become more and more popular over the years is low or no-till farming. And I should say that doesn't necessarily mean that you're not tilling at all in either low or no-till systems. Usually you do have to at least practice some sort of tillage methods, some plowing, disking, and cultivating, at least initially. But the idea is that once you have that soil worked, you're going to leave some vegetation in place. And often they will use herbicides to kill the vegetation that is left in place. Lots of acreage of the Midwest has been converted to low or no-till as a way to conserve soil. And I think it does require some special equipment. So in this case, they're saying that we've planted seeds or transplants in trenches made by a shallow chisel plow within the residue. And that crop residue does serve as a mulch. So it's conserving moisture. And it also is, keeping the soil in place, but I will say it's not a cure-all. There are issues with that. Anytime you have mulch, sometimes you also have habitat for pests. All right, let's look at a kind of different topic altogether. Rather than conserving soil, let's think about almost making soil, and usually what we call media. And in the case of growing in a greenhouse or any kind of controlled environment agriculture, this is what we're using. We're not using soil itself, we're using soilless mixes. And it's basically still has all the same characteristics as a native soil. The difference is that it's not coming from parent rock. naturally formed on site. Some of it is coming from rock, but it's a variety, a mixture of different components together to still provide the anchor and the nutrient and water exchange that soil does, but just doing it in a different way, in a different environment. Um, each of your components in the mix is going to impart a different characteristic. And it allows you to kind of custom tailor that mix to, what you're growing. So we don't usually use artificial soils, soilless mixes on a large scale. We're not using them in usually in the field. We might use them as an amendment to the natural soil. Now they do use them in some cases in construction sites, on athletic fields and golf courses, in particular areas. But mostly we're thinking of more controlled environment agriculture and greenhouses, etc. So what is the media? Things that any source of organic matter, often things like peat moss, um, coconut coir, which is like made from the husks of coconuts, all kinds of different sand, um, vermiculite, perlite, sometimes even clay is added, um, tree bark that has, or in some cases even sawdust, rock wool. These are all different types of components that could be used as media. Here we have some perlite, often used to provide more drainage in soil media. Here we've got some calcined clay. Actually, these are switched. That's peat moss there, and calcined clay here. Peat moss is usually the bulk of most mixes. If you buy potting soil, usually it's based on either peat moss or tree bark, or a mix of the two. I don't see calcined clay often as an additive to many commercial mixes. You more often see vermiculite, which is actually pretty similar. Either way, those are some components that you could see in a soilless mix. Here's just some concept of what it's adding here. Sand or perlite adds larger pore spaces and provides good drainage. We use vermiculite to hold water. It also has some cation exchange capacity, so it can hold nutrients as well. Peat moss itself has good nutrient holding capacity, and it does, because peat is formed in kind of acidic bogs, it does lower the pH, which most container production, they do want a lower pH. Usually they are also adding some sort of fertilizer in there, which, these ingredients here, sand vermiculite and sphagnum, all together, they don't have much natural fertility. So we have to put something in there. I think that's something that a lot of people forget when they're trying to grow plants in containers, is they still need the same nutrients. And actually they probably need more of them, because these different components don't hold the nutrients as much, other than like the calcined clay. All right, so the book kind of jumps around here, but getting back to the idea of irrigation and kind of water management along with soil and fertility management. We mentioned irrigation earlier on, and talked about how if there wasn't enough natural precipitation, generally irrigation, popped up. So we have been irrigating crops by either controlling natural flow of water, or in many cases also just pumping it from groundwater as well. So whenever we talk about irrigation, water quality is just as important, if not more important, than the quantity of water. So we have to be sure that we're not adding much salt or other foreign chemicals to the soil through adding irrigation water. So when we think about water management, we look at the chemical properties, and of course, pH plays a big role there. Um, Whatever your water supply is can affect the soil's pH and nutrient availability as well. So generally, most of our tap water is more alkaline because through the various ways that they treat the water, they're making it, bringing it up in pH. And most tap water is probably at or slightly above neutral. I'm sure that's different per location. Ours is a little bit above that because a lot of that natural groundwater and surface water as well, the rivers are kind of flowing through a lot of areas that there is a lot of limestone, which gives more of these carbonates, which raises that pH and also changes the buffering capacity of the water, which means that we have to add more acid to it to lower the pH than we would if it were at a lower natural alkalinity. So whenever we're applying water, we're going to think of that again as part of this kind of whole system. And we have to integrate all of this stuff together to determine how we're going to grow the crop. So of course, we have to look first at the climate and the type of crop to see what we have to add, as well as the physical properties of the soil and the terrain topography of wherever we're able to produce a crop. Then also thinking about kind of in conjunction with the climate and the soil, how much water do we naturally have? And then if we need to add water, what is the cost of it? What is the quality of the water that we're adding? What's the availability of that water? And what is the drainage capability of our soil itself? So we have a local grower here who's been doing it organic for years, but I have to kind of poke at him a little bit because I'm like, really, is it really organic when you're using county water that is, had all kinds of chlorine and fluoride added to it? Either way, something to consider when we're talking about water quality, because indeed, in adding that chlorinated and fluorinated water, that stuff is adding salt to your soil, increasing the soluble salt content. All right, so we started to look at some methods of irrigation. Here's another look at them. We got flood irrigation, where we're flooding the whole field or the whole cropping area. But this is really only used where the topography is fairly level. And then it is modified and graded to where there is a slight slope so that you do have some drainage. More often we see this type, which is similar to flood irrigation, except we're using raised beds for our crops. And maybe we use a lister attachment to have these higher mounds of soil to create these furrows. And then we're flooding the ditch itself, and then water is flowing into those furrows, kind of confined to them rather than the whole cropping area. And that's much better, I think, for the plant as well as for any water quality issues, which this is a field of lettuce here, and it just reminds me of some of the water quality issues associated with both flood and furrow irrigation. Not nearly as much with furrow irrigation as flood, but with contaminants in the water, especially E. coli. So in furrow irrigation, of course, that water is much more efficiently used because the entire surface isn't getting wetted. It's actually using kind of capillary action to move that water to the plants, and that reduces loss of water due to evaporation and reduces contaminants as well. Looking at it kind of more on the controlled environment perspective, a similar concept is ebb and flow or ebb and flood irrigation, where yeah, either benches, like in this case, we got a table here where water is coming from below. So this is called sub irrigation. And again, it's using the capillary action of the media in the containers to draw that water into the root zone. Um, so they have benches where they do that. In some cases, they also will do that on entire floors, concrete floors of greenhouses as well. So um, I think it's very efficient use of water, as well as you're not getting the top of the plant wet. So you're cutting down on a lot of foliar diseases too. Of course, it does require, a significant investment in the floor or the bench itself. Of course, we also have overhead irrigation, where we're basically applying that water through different nozzles, and we're able to kind of customize different spray patterns through these emitters or nozzles. Um, Either way, if you're whatever type of irrigation you're using, and if you're starting things from seed, then you do have to have some sort of uniformity there to make sure that the seed is going to be able to germinate by having enough water. So with overhead irrigation, we might use less total water um, as compared to flood or furrow, but um, we also lose a lot because of evaporation, because you're getting the plant canopy wet rather than the soil surface itself. But it can be used for washing salts away from salt sensitive crops. And also, in some cases, they use sprinklers for frost control. By putting that water on plants in times of frost, it can either raise the kind of specific heat around the plant, or allow ice to form a layer outside of it that ends up protecting it from really cold temperatures, which I know seems counterintuitive, but that's what they do. Whenever we talk about any kind of sprinkler irrigation, we also have to look at what the water quality is, what the source of it is, how we're getting it to the crops, and the equipment um, that is associated with that. So equipment and energy costs are usually higher with any kind of overhead or sprinkler irrigation. Going back to using these kind of in a really in any situation, but pictured here in a greenhouse, they've got a riser pipe here placed along an area to get it the nozzles above or emitters above the surface, the crop canopy itself. So many different types of overhead irrigation. I think we looked at these before. You see these a lot in the western states. Wheel line assembly that basically these are sprinklers that are just mounted on some sort of axle, and then we have it propelled by an engine, so it's moving across the field. There's a variation of that in greenhouses with basically an overhead boom system that runs the length of the greenhouse and emits water based on a variety of emitters. So here are some different types of emitters that in this case you can switch it depending on what kind of crop you're growing to either mist it or to kind of be more of like a stream, or to apply pesticides or plant growth regulators. If you've flown over the US at any point, flown across the country, then you've probably seen images that look like this from the center pivot system, often where land value or availability of labor is low. So it's just one kind of line on wheels that follows this circular path around this fixed point. The downside of this is that it does leave the corners and kind of rectangular fields unirrigated, and kind of forces you into losing a little bit of land. As I mentioned before, sprinkler systems are prone to loss of water due to evaporation. They've kind of gotten that better by engineering systems where it's getting closer to the plant or closer to the soil, so that it's preventing some of that loss. We mentioned before that drip irrigation is, in terms of water use, the most efficient form, and it's the most precise form. Um, However, of course, drip irrigation systems also have their issues too. With these drip systems, it's wetting the soil without runoff. It's also reducing evaporative losses, but the emitters themselves, because it's dripping slowly, they're often subject to getting clogged. So, of course, drip irrigation, you don't have to move it. You have little interference with other ag operations. You also have less fluctuation. You have more consistency in the water itself, and altogether less water is needed. Of course, there are downsides with the expense of the equipment itself, but also the filtration equipment to avoid clogging emitters. Even with that filtration equipment, it still happens. You can get uneven distribution depending on the soil type and the slope of the land. You'll also tend to have salts concentrating right in that crop zone because you're not getting leaching of the excess salts and water. There are many different ways to control irrigation. Here's just one of the ways. This is through a tensiometer, which is, think of it as like a soil sensor in a way, but this is measuring it based on the tension, how much pressure there is in the soil. This is an image that is basically of the same system we have in our greenhouse that is basically governing the irrigation through some sort of sensor, or usually by releasing a particular amount. These have become a lot more sophisticated over the years, to where it is able to measure moisture in the air, moisture in the soil, and apply water based on that automatically. All right, so of course, we think about adding water. You also have to think in wet places of draining water too. So generally we do that through some sort of tile, or a drain tile, which is often made of clay, or a perforated plastic pipe buried underground to basically move water and drain it off of areas. Of course, we also need to note that again, the importance of wetlands. We talked about this early on in ecology, and how important wetlands systems are to natural ecosystems. So there's more effort being made to restore wetlands in some places, and there are ways that you could even do that on the farm. Still basically have all your water draining to a place where you don't have as much drainage, or maybe a place where you can't use as much cropping. Real quick here on kind of fertilizers. It is important to note that the use of synthetic fertilizers has increased crop yields and affected world hunger probably more than any other agricultural practice. However, fertilizers can cause some issues too. And most of those issues are associated with the runoff of fertilizers, or the addition of too much fertilizer. So the second highest pollutant of waterways is through nitrogen. And that's usually through over fertilization, because nitrogen is very mobile and easily runs off. So here's just a look at some different ways of applying fertilizer. It could be through a large utility vehicle. In this case, they're applying lime to kind of raise the pH of the soil, probably to make other nutrients more accessible. Here's a hopper, basically, that's just adding that on a granular fertilizer, kind of on a lower level. Here's another look at adding a liquid slurry of a manure to soil, which is also, the benefit of that is that it's also adding organic matter that in turn improves the soil structure too. So manure is a great addition to soil. It's not just adding the nutrients, it's adding organic matter. And the addition of organic matter is probably the single best thing you can do to affect the soil structure. Generally, crop should have its own fertilization system. And for most of our field crops, that's going to be adding a complete fertilizer kind of at the beginning of the growing season, at least to get them started. And then in general, adding more of a lower concentration throughout the season, depending on the plant's needs at the time. And we're actually kind of beyond time here, so I think we can come back to this.
How close are you to finishing?
We got 8 more slides, Tom.
I mean, if you can knock it out in the next few minutes, go right ahead.
All right, thank you, sir. I appreciate it.
Yep, you owe me.
I owe you one, or probably a few, actually. Let's talk a little bit about the different types of fertilizers, and I'm sure you guys will be able to get through this kind of quickly because you're all familiar with all of this. The numbers on the bag, right? The N, P, and K. And we call it a complete fertilizer if it adds all 3 of those primary and major macronutrients. And this is expressed as a percentage of the weight of the whole bag. So let's say this was a 100-pound bag, just to make the math easy, that would be 15 pounds of nitrogen, 16 pounds of phosphorus, 17 pounds of potassium. However, ways include all the compounds that are used to actually make up the fertilizer itself. So keep that in mind, that there are different formulations, and sometimes these are proprietary information, so they're not going to put it on the bag. How do we, really know how much fertilizer to apply? The best way to do that is to compare that to soil testing or growing media testing if it's in a controlled environment. Looking at that, usually fall is the best time to do this, so we can kind of buffer the pH. We can make some of those changes, add some of those nutrients in a way that's going to fix them kind of longer term. There are ways to do tissue testing as well, so you can actually test the nutrients in the plant's tissue itself. Those are more complicated and don't work quite as well. I'm sure that the technology is improving though. At the minimum though, you should be testing your soil at least at the beginning of each growing season. We talked about this before, how the availability of certain elements is regulated by pH, and ideally we want it kind of hovering around neutral. Slightly acidic up to neutral is best for the widest variety of nutrients available for plants. And we can adjust pH generally to raise it by adding lime, or to lower it by adding usually sulfur-based compounds. And generally our soil in our region, kind of in the mid-Atlantic, tends to be a little bit lower pH, higher on the acidity scale. I think we already looked at this chart before, but again, the reason that plants need this, kind of, around neutral is because that's where we have the greatest availability of the widest range of nutrients. We also mentioned this in kind of soil conversation, and earlier we talked about the cation exchange capacity, and abbreviated as CEC. That's not, again, it's really not going to tell us about the fertility of the soil, but the soil's ability to hold on to the positively charged minerals, ions, that elements themselves that are the plant nutrients. most of them. There are some anions out there as well, so it's important to look at anion exchange capacity too. But in most cases, we might add clay or organic matter to increase soil pH, or sorry, CEC. Some other cases though, in controlled environments, growing media has little or no CEC, and that's desired because we're supplying those nutrients constantly through the flow of a solution that has all those nutrients dissolved in it. So we started to talk about how we apply those nutrients. One way is through injecting gas self, kind of a dangerous way of doing it, but it is used still to this day. Generally though, I think mostly we're either adding a solid or liquid, and the solids are usually in the form of some organic matter or a salt that is either in the form of a powder or a dust, or a granule or pelletized fertilizer, as well as liquids such as slurries or just fertilizers dissolved in water. It is important to note, though, that some nutrients, such as iron, are not soluble in water. So in order to make those available, they have to be chelated with a soluble molecule, which basically it's just attaching iron to that molecule so that it does take that iron with it. So just know that if you ever have to apply an iron-based fertilizer, it does have to be chelated to really get the positive effect. Really the last thing I wanted to mention here is the application of fertilizer in irrigation water, which is termed fertigation. And we do this basically through an injector that puts the concentrated solution and mixes it at the proper dilution into the irrigation water that you're adding. And usually I think we see it mostly as like 1 to 50 or 1 to 100. So this is just what some of these fertilizer injectors look like. This is what we have in our greenhouse, the dosatron. But there are kind of stationary places to kind of mount these, as well as you can even do it as a hose end injector as well. And that ends chapter 14 on soil, water, and fertility management. Anybody have any questions, comments, or concerns? All right, well, thank you again, Tom. I'm thankful for you guys for taking this class, and I hope you have been enjoying it. But nonetheless, have a happy Thanksgiving. Enjoy the holiday. Be careful.
Yep, you too. Bye.
See ya.
Oh, what?